About ICSA. Founded in 1979, the International Cultic Studies Association, or ICSA, is a global network of people concerned about psychological manipulation and abuse in cultic and other high-control environments. ICSA is tax-exempt, supports civil liberties, and is not affiliated with any religious or commercial organizations. Our mission. ICSA provides information, education, and help to those adversely affected by or interested in cultic and other high-control groups and relationships. Connect with us on Twitter at ICSA Home, Facebook at ICSA Today, or become a member or donate at icsahome.com/membership. Disclaimer. Views expressed on ICSA websites or in ICSA's publications or events are those of the document's author or speaker and are not necessarily shared, endorsed, or recommended by ICSA or any of its directors, staff, or advisors.
The most extensive mistake I've had in my life.
It talks about the motivation of at least some of us to be in this session, which is well deserved in this case. No? So let me introduce our presenters for today. First we have Dr. Dubrow-Marshall, who is Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Glamorgan in Wales. His principal research is on social influence, including the psychological effects of cultic group membership, influence in organizational settings, and the psychological processes involved in social group identity and prejudice. He will be talking, and then he will receive questions where you would like to do so. And then Maribeth Ayala will be talking next. She teaches sociology at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. She is author of Insane Therapy, Portrait of a Psychotherapy Cult, published by Temple University Press. She is presently researching a book on sex and gender in cults. So Dr. Ayala will talk after her.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm very pleased to be here. And I should just start by saying that Paul Martin and I planned this presentation this morning, and I know many of you know Paul, and he would dearly love to be here as well, and he sends his good wishes to the conference. And I will be making a small announcement on his behalf later on at the members' meeting, because he has sent a message to the ICSA conference, but it's full of good wishes to us all, particularly those of us who are here for research, like here again today as we were on Thursday, of course. I'm talking this morning then about the Totalistic Identity Theory for cults and extremist groups, which I developed with Paul and with Linda and with a whole team of researchers really over the years, where we've been analysing the data for former members of cultic groups who visited the Wellspring Treatment Resource Centre in Ohio. And Paul and I presented on this topic at previous ICSA conferences and also at the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, and also in a different way with Linda at the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy in the United Kingdom, and Paul and I also presenting on this soon at the British Psychological Society Social Psychology section. So I say that only to indicate that we're trying to get traction for the theory within the mainstream academic professions in psychology and psychotherapy within the United Kingdom, which I think is important for the cultic studies field. Okay, I'm going to go on now to talk about the theoretical approaches then to explaining group experiences in what can be variously referred to, as we know, as either new religious movements or cults. And of course we have a wealth of theoretical material to fall back on, both from clinical and sociological approaches, such as Lipton's thought-reform approach, which many I know are familiar with. More important for the theory I'll be talking about today, perhaps, the theory of bounded choice by Yang and Lalich. And it was also interesting to hear yesterday Eileen Barker talk about boundaries. Two theories actually there within sociology that in one sense talk in sociological terms rather similarly to the ways in which I'll go on to talk about boundaries in psychological terms. We've had the development of the group psychological abuse scale over many years, and Carmen and colleagues, Kimi Alpi, who's here this morning, have developed that scale internationally, but theoretically that's a way of trying to express the group experience in objective terms, what actually was the experience that people had in their group. And this morning I'll be talking about the applications from what one might call mainstream social psychology, but as I will go on to show, and as many of you will know, one person's mainstream is another person's tributary, so we'll see what's more or less mainstream about this theory as we go along. But certainly social identity theory, I believe, is a critical theory for us to consider, as is its successor theory, so self-categorization theory. It's appropriate always, I think, to be talking about this in Europe. It was particularly appropriate to be talking about it in Belgium a couple of years ago, given Helmut Tauscher's background in Belgium, but this is what's referred to as the European school of social psychology, distinct in many respects from more individualistic accounts in the United States. So the question that's posed then, theoretically, is can this help us understand that part of the person's psychology that is affected by group membership? And the language here is similar to that which one will see in the sociological accounts of Lalich and what we've heard at this conference from colleagues like Ben Zablocki and Steve Kent. It is also subtly different when we talk about the person's psychology. So what does that mean for us? And I want to introduce in this sense, and I realise some of you will have be aware of these theories before others won't. The extent of group identity scale, which we refer to as EGIS for short, it was developed back in 2003 by myself, Ron Burks and Paul Martin at the Wellspring retreat. And this was really an attempt to say to people who've been former members of groups, because remember in Wellspring's case it's almost always the case that people were members, they're not currently members of cultic groups. What was that experience like? And to put those questions in value-neutral terms, in other words, to say how important was the group to you at the time? Did you think it was going to change the world, or something similar to that at the time? Did being in the group mean that you did nothing else, virtually? In other words, the questions that might indicate the extent, literally, of group identity for the person back then. And unlike the group psychological abuse scale, that literally tries to measure abuse, so it talks about negative things, the extent of group identity scale, which is a short scale of only 9 items, actually doesn't talk about negative things at all. It simply says how important was the group for you in different respects at the time, how much of your life did it take up. You could see that as slightly negative, but of course at the time, before the doubt set in, sometimes people think that that's a good thing, it's taking up all their life. It's a complex journey that people go on. And so in a sense, taking this scale at Wellspring is part of that overall psychotherapeutic process of thinking back to the experience that one's had during group membership. Okay, this was based on a local identity scale which I developed in the 1990s. That was about how much one identifies with one's hometown or region, or it can even be, of course, extended to nation state. And this rests on the proposed social category accessibility model of Penelope Oakes from 1987. And Penelope Oakes' approach to accessibility was basically, as I say, to ask this question: how important is or was the group to the person? And also, as my scale goes on to do, how much did this distinguish you from others? So, of course, groups can vary on these. One's identification with a group can vary on these two dimensions. You could identify very strongly with a group that actually didn't distinguish you that much from everybody else. However, the group could be highly polarized, as we'll see, and the distinguishing features in the context would be very different. So accessibility potentially asks those two things, as does the notion of social category fit, which was the other part of the equation that John Turner devised as part of the self-categorization theory. In other words, we can't think about groups outside of social context, but the difference in a psychological approach is that we recognise that that social context exists within the person. It doesn't just exist in the social world. In fact, psychologists can argue, and sometimes do argue, that it's only really that social reality of the mind that exists for people at all, and that we're always merely observing social reality externally. We think we're looking at an external world, but of course we're perceiving it ourselves, we're making our minds up about that. That's the theoretical background, which I'm going to explain more about in a moment, that led to the development then of totalistic identity theory, which I first presented about 2 years ago in Brussels. So the social identity theory European approach, basically, as this little diagram shows, and you can see the extent of my artistic skills here, certainly within the limits of the software anyway, that one, I don't have a pointer, I'm afraid, but one can see the social forces impacting on the individual. And clearly, for a lot of sociologists, a lot of social scientists, a lot of social psychologists indeed, is how social influence impacts on the individual, external on the individual. That's the point of concern, the matter of concern. What the European School of Social Psychology did, however, was to say, yes, that happens, but critically, we're interested in how the social becomes part of the person, or is in fact part of the person, in fact, from day one. And this is, in that sense, links back to theories that go back over 50 years. The notion that the social world is part of the person's identity, and takes us back, for example, to Jerome Bruner's work in the 1950s, about perceptual readiness. In other words, we carry within our cognitive system different social categories. That can be for our country, our local place, as I've said. It can be for different groups, football teams, soccer teams, other sports teams we might support. And of course, our topic of concern is Cultic groups, but there'll be groups that people will join, religions, political groups, which will be part of that cognitive repertoire. And that at different times, groups will be more or less salient psychologically as a consequence of perceptual readiness, how high up our cognitive repertoire is the group, and as we'll go on to show, the theory postulates that with cult it's very high up, that cognitive repertoire indeed. So self-categorization theory then poses that groups form psychologically, and that as well as existing socially, groups, categories, social categories form cognitively all the time as part of our normal cognitive processing. So this is a socio-cognitive theory, and in a sense it's that cognitive component to it that can distinguish it from perhaps more sociological based accounts. So this is how self-categorization theory proposes that people move normally, very easily and straightforwardly between different levels within their cognitive system. And again, rather like the talk from Eileen Barker yesterday, these are groups that people can join and leave relatively easily, and on the psychological level you can move between them rather easily as well. Like I said, it's becoming quite hard to leave the human being level behind, but I'm talking here in that sense psychologically. One moment might be thinking of oneself at that subordinate level as a member of the human race. If, for example, one's thinking about issues like global warming, for example, or world poverty, one could arguably be thinking at the global level. However, we might then move to this whole range of different groups, what Eleanor Walsh in 1978 calls the basic level, group level of categorization. So that can be one's job, country, town, and then the individual, personal level of categorization. These can be one's own goals, one's own preferences, relationships with family members, what we might call also interpersonal level in terms of relationships. what self-categorization theory says critically, though, is that categorization takes place at all of these levels. There's nothing special about one level over the other. People can move up and down. There are different levels of abstraction. But critically, the group level is psychological. So when we talk about groups, we acknowledge that they are psychological groups. They become part of our psychological system, as the little diagram indicates. So in terms of the theory then, each category, each group has a different level of accessibility based on Bloom's concept of perceptual readiness. According to the social context in which one is also viewing social stimuli, what's also referred to in the theory as category fit, the level of accessibility of a category will be more or less salient. And here we start to think about how Lifton, as a different type of psychologist in terms of the psychiatrist indeed, talks about the milieu. And in a sense, when we talk about social context, we're talking about the milieu that somebody will be operating within. In psychological terms, this is how much social stimuli relates to the group in context and how important in one's mind, in one's cognitive repertoire is the group. And when both of those things are high, the group is highly salient psychologically for the person. So groups will therefore clearly differ in how important they are to us and how much we value them. And normally those things can also change over time as well. But also according to where we are. So normally we don't think as much about our sports team when we're at work. Normally we don't think as much about work when we're away from work. So where we move to, the social stimuli will to a certain extent affect that psychological salience in normal processing. And therefore usually people move from one group categorization to another from minute to minute. And there's even a debate within social psychology about whether two categorizations can be salient literally at the same time. But for now I'm sticking with the original proposition, which is one moves from them very quickly from one to another. And as I say, people can move up that hierarchy as well, from the personal level to the social level to the superordinate level. Now the theoretical hypothesis then, this is based on all the work of Lifton, Singer and many others that I came up with, was that this is not what happens in groups that exert undue influence, some new religious movements, cults or other groups. So instead, we come now to the Totalistic Identity Theory that I first presented, as I say, a couple of years ago, which is the categorization effectively becomes stuck in one place in a person's cognitive system, and a place which dominates. Again, on a sociological level, we can say that that group is highly bounded. There's lots of boundaries, to use Barker's terms, to use Jan Jelalich's theory. The choices, the behavioural options become highly constrained. The bounded choice theory in psychological terms, unlike normally where people shift up and down the hierarchy and shift between groups, effectively the categorization becomes locked most of the time in one place on this group that dominates psychologically. Highly salient, this is where the milieu control is a very useful concept to explain that part of the equation, but also a group in psychological terms within the person's psychological system that is extremely important to them, that dominates over other groups. Other groups, in a sense, become almost vanquished from the system. So this is where, in a way, in cognitive terms, this is a way of trying to express brainwashing, which is a term, it's one that's troubled many people, I know, but I think actually is a way of explaining how it can appear that the group completely dominates the person's cognitive repertoire while they're fully in. Now, of course, people have different journeys through cults. I'm not trying to suggest that everyone is literally stuck and completely dominated all the time. I think people move away from that dominant position at various points, and indeed the leaving trajectory often involves clearly people gradually moving away from that position. It does, however, leave a big hole, and in psychological and clinical terms, this is where we return to the Wellspring clients in terms of what kind of hole is perhaps left afterwards. The other thing I wanted to say then about totalistic identity theory is that it also can explain how groups become polarized within the frame of reference. And here I've put this diagram up when I've explained about TIT before, to indicate that if one takes that has that dominant social psychological identity, where one sits relatively then to other people within the social context will also change. Your perception, in other words, will become distorted. And here is a political topology. It's fairly UK-centric, I'm afraid, but many will recognise the communist, fascist dimension. Supposed left, supposed right. I mean, we'll all remember as well the argument that they meet around the other side, arguably, if one sees it as three-dimensional. And the middle ground then, the socialists, the conservatives, one could have social democrats, Christian democrats from a European perspective, indeed democrats and republicans from an American perspective in the middle, arguably. And then we have the more extreme frame of reference, the distorted frame of reference. And notice here that what's normally the bulk of the frame of reference over here, the Labour and fascist part, has actually become pushed over to the right-hand side. So the way that one perceives politics if one's in a, say, a left political group is that everyone's to the right of you, basically. So if you're in these groups, Revolutionary Communist Party, Alliance for Workers' Liberty, I think that one's called, the way you're going to view everyone else is that everyone else is going to be perceived to be the other frame of reference. And again, in self-categorization theory, the stronger the group identity, the likelihood is the more polarized one's going to view one's group as opposed to everybody else, which of course goes to one of the other Lifton components, which is the belief that your group is special and better than everyone else's group, that superiority complex, if you like. So this can be explained. I'm sorry to bring the whole slide up, but I do this to try and move us through this. That we're redefining social influence as something slightly different from before within the totalistic identity self-categorization approach, which is to say that most group-based or prototypical actions are actually examples of the group norms. So when you behave as a group member, what you're doing is you're carrying out the agreed priorities of the group, what will be perceived by the group as most correct and most valued. We're all familiar with that notion, but why are we doing that? Do people do that in groups simply because they feel pressured to do so, which is the traditional approach from within social psychology from people like Deutsch and Gerard, that there is this normative influence. We feel pressured into carrying out these actions because of disapproval from the group or from the group leader. This theory actually takes it a step further and says that actually, if you believe strongly in the group, when you carry out these behaviours, you're actually reinforcing that part of your identity that identifies with the group, the social self-identity. So carrying out the norm or the action actually boosts what has been referred to by Branscombe and Wang as collective self-esteem. It might not help your other aspects of self-esteem, but it's a part of self-esteem nonetheless that's related to the group. So the reality of this, and this is an important if not controversial point, is that cult members may not feel externally pressured, which might explain why, of course, in some of the literature that Carmen presented on Thursday, you don't always get self-reports from current members that they feel as pressured as people report they feel afterwards. It also might explain then why it is that afterwards there's that change, not simply that people get annoyed, the atrocity tale argument, but instead that their perceptual frame of reference alters, that at the time it feels self-referential, it feels as if they're behaving in a way that reinforces their identity that's dominated at the group level. Of course, when it's not dominated at the group level anymore, when one thinks back, you think, why did I do all those things? And so it doesn't make sense anymore because one doesn't have the group identity. I say that feeling having been there. So in that sense, we can see psychologically how we're behaving in a way, or people may behave in a way when they're in the group, that represents for them at the time what they see as the better part of themselves. In that sense, to perceive what you think, this is the penultimate bullet point, to perceive what you think is the best part of yourself is actually false, is counterintuitive. It's almost as if you're thinking against yourself. So here I posit that what I'm saying is very similar to the double-bind position of Gregory Bateson, which was taken up then further by R.D. Lang and others in psychiatry and counselling psychology. That in fact, once one becomes trapped psychologically in this way, it's very hard to break out of that cycle. And that in fact mystifies the experience, particularly if the views of the group take you to that polarized position. So you end up spending disproportionate amounts of time doing things that most people in the world simply don't have any understanding of whatsoever. And it can be very hard, as we know, to explain that and come to terms with that afterwards. So this is, in a sense, a cognitive and social psychological level explanation of what many clinical accounts have already identified. And I'm not saying that the social psychological account is better, but I'm simply saying it can be an alternative and useful way of explaining the phenomenon of cults and cultic groups. So the model of harm then that's underpinning the theory I'll move to now, because I've explained how the basic elements of totalistic identity theory, and I want to move to the harm that Wellspring has measured and show how in effect we were testing out this theory with the data that had been collected at Wellspring. We started with the proposition, and this was actually earlier than the development of the theory really, based on all the clinical accounts, based on earlier analyses that Paul Martin and others have done. Is the pattern of harm different in ex-members of new religious groups and other high demand groups compared to members of other types of groups? So, and here the other question, is this different then from typical post-traumatic stress recorded in specific traumatic circumstances? And here there is an interesting dichotomy, because often one accepts that trauma may result from a traumatic event such as a mass accident. However, it's been much more difficult for clinicians to get it accepted that harm may result from membership of the group. Why is that? So in that sense, maybe that requires us to see if there's a different pattern of harm from cults or new religious movements compared to those other types of groups. Is it more akin to long-term abusive one-to-one relationships as another way of posing, and all the work has been done in that regard as well, including again by researchers in Spain, who was presented yesterday in the session Carmen facilitated. But also with this group dimension, this is where the group psychological abuse scale that's been given out at Wellspring for many years is very useful for measuring that group dimension. But then, and this was the new part of this that we started doing from 2003 onwards, was to say we're measuring the group dimension of abuse, that experience dimension. We're looking at the clinical measures, but now we can relate it to this extent of group identity. We can start to see whether that hypothesis about the level of identity being related then to some of the harm and to the group experience as measured by the GPA, whether that hypothesis can be borne out. And so the extent of undue influence, we can say, is what the group psychological abuse scale is attempting to measure, that group dimension of abuse. So previous analysis that I've presented, Paul and I have presented previously, has shown the Wellspring retreat that the treatment program is highly efficacious, that there are strong treatment effects from intake to discharge, and we presented that in 2003 and subsequently. And we've also shown as well that measure of undue influence, the group psychological abuse scale, is positively related in correlational terms to psychological measures of harm, be those depression, dissociation, anxiety typically, but also other measures on other inventories. And we've also found previously that treatment effect in one sense is mediated by the GPA, and I'll come back to that particular point in a moment. We presented that paper again back in 2003. It's also been shown that Wellspring clients have higher harm than college students. I presented a paper back in 2003 that showed that, and other research has been done again to show that if you compare ex-cult member populations, typically they do show higher harm than students, and that is what's been shown in the international study that Carl and colleagues have been involved with. The Wellspring sample, I have to say, is also higher than some of the clinical norms as well. So I'm giving you the background data before I move more specifically to the data that answers the Totalistic Identity Theory hypothesis. We've also found typically that the GPA is a single factor scale, and for those of you familiar with it, I know not everyone will be, but the original factor structure for the group psychological abuse scale was 4 factors. Typically we've only found a single factor at Wellspring. So moving on to the specifics of the study I'm presenting this morning then. The measures used at the Wellspring retreat, remember that there's approximately 80% or more from new religious movements or cults, and the data set then includes a total total sample size of 567, and Paul Martin and I believe that this is the largest sample anywhere in the world from a residential treatment programme. So that's that point. And clients do receive this specialised treatment programme from Paul and colleagues that's been developed around the Lifton themes, and out of which Paul has also developed the Lifton scale. So the key measures of psychopathology that I'll be presenting this morning then, as I've said, is a measure of depression, the Beck Depression Inventory, the Hopkins Dissociation, screening measure of dissociation, and then with the symptom checklist 90 by Delegatis and colleagues, I'm presenting just the global severity index here as a global measure of anxiety. So testing out the theory then, here are the specific hypotheses. Number 1 is that extent of group identity as measured by that specific scale will correlate significantly with measures of psychopathology, in other words, depression, dissociation, and anxiety. In other words, having that dominant cognitive category, I am positive, is not healthy psychologically, that it has effects both at the time and afterwards. And here I'm being very careful to be non-ideological when I say that. I'm not saying it's wrong to have the beliefs, but for them to dominate in the way that's hypothesized by TRT would suggest perhaps psychological effects at some point for some people. This will indicate then the totalistic nature of the group identities, perhaps what's leading to the psychological damage. This is the hypothesis then, that on a cognitive level, if we can show that there has been this dominant group identity, this may lead to psychological damage of those 3 types. The second prediction is that the specialised treatment programme that addresses the group-related aspects of that psychopathology will be shown as efficacious, in other words, that there will be a treatment effect. And again, this can be taken to indicate that a group-based psychopathology and identity exists, and this can be shown statistically, as I'll go on to show in a few minutes. So here are some interim findings testing out this theoretical conception of totalistic identity. The relationships, first of all, then. And the first relationship that we have here is between extent of group identity and the group psychological abuse scale, and showing a upward curve indicating a positive relationship between these 2 measures. What this indicates is the more you identify with the group, the more you said you identified with the group, the more there is reporting of abuse in the group as measured by the group psychological abuse scale. So what this suggests is that measure of what has been the experience in the group in terms of abuse correlates positively with the extent of identity. Remember, as I said at the beginning, the extent of group identity scale is neutral, saying how important was the group at the time. And then the group psychological abuse scale is saying how abusive was it at the time, and the 2 correlate. So we've been able to show that somebody can think about how much in a positive sense they identify with the group, and also report in a way that shows a relationship, the extent of the abuse that they believe was taking place, the undue influence in the group. So a significant relationship there. And then we also found a significant relationship between extent of group identity and the Beck Depression Inventory. what this suggests is the more the person believed in the group, the more they believed that the group was dominant in their lives at the time, the more they report depression or on the effect depression inventory afterwards. I'll go on and show the next one as well, because the two can be usefully explained, I think, together, which is that, as well as that, there's also a significant relationship between extended group identity and the dissociation measure. In other words, the more the person identified with the group, the more dominant that group identity was in the way that TIT suggests, the more dissociation there is afterwards. And this provides evidence of what I call the whole effect, the fact that if it's that dominant for the individual, of course once you leave, that leaves a big gap, which can of course be picked up in measures of dissociation and depression. Interestingly as well, of course, the fact that it can become so dominant such that other social categories that people normally use to live by, such as their work category, and we know of course of how many ex-members report not being able to hold down their jobs in the same way, how that can also lead to dissociation, because you're not really seeing the world when it's so dominant in the way that other people see the world, and that can of course also lead to aspects of dissociation at the time. And then the third significant relationship that's been shown is the relationship between extended group identity and this anxiety measure, the Global Severity Index, again indicating that ex-members report the more that they identified with the group, the more dominant the group was, the more they report anxiety. Again, this is obviously afterwards. But again, this indicates that this leaves members with this high level of anxiety, and again, is an argument for saying that maybe there's something psychologically unhealthy the more dominant that group identity is to the exclusion of all other types of identity for the individual. Then we move to the treatment effects. A couple of treatment effects I'm presenting this morning quickly, which is the treatment effect for the depression inventory from Wellspring, starting out with a mean of 19.92, nearly 20 at the start. And after the 2-week treatment program, clients show a reduced mean of 10. So a huge drop in terms of the depression as a consequence of the treatment program at the Wellspring retreat. And actually, even though the bar charts don't look the same, this is one of the problems with bar charts, you can alter the scaling to make them look more or less impressive in terms of the difference between them, but this is actually almost as statistically significant. This is the treatment effect on the Hopkins dissociation measure. So it should be clear that the treatment approach of Wellspring is working in terms of dealing with these presenting psychological problems. That might indicate that because that treatment program is so specific and related to group experience, it uses aspects of the Lifton approach to thought reform in its approach. This might indicate that we are dealing here with a specific form of group-based psychopathology. And we can test this out statistically in the following way. What we did was we conducted an analysis of covariance on the treatment effects, this one being the treatment effect for depression. And we said, if we take out the shared variance that exists between depression and extended group identity, in other words, we saw that correlational relationship earlier on between extended group identity and depression. If you covary that out, do you still get a treatment effect? And the answer is no, you don't. That when you take that shared variance out, the treatment effect disappears. So over here on the left, in the white, in the Beck circle, is the part of depression not related to group identity, and this appears to not be affected by treatment. So here's a revelation. People might be depressed for other reasons, and that's important to note, not just about the group. And that's perfectly reasonable, given as well that the length of time out of the group at Wellspring is tremendously variable. they get people out a couple of weeks to several years, so of course other things intervene. The shared variance, though, in the middle is the important thing. This is the part of the depression that is related to the group identity from the correlation, is the part that then is significantly affected by the treatment. And this does indicate, for the first time, that there is a group-related psychopathology that's specifically affected by the treatment program. And we don't just find this with the best, because it's always good to get this consistently on more than one clinical item. We also find exactly the same result with regard to dissociation. So in other words, people can dissociate for all kinds of reasons. In hot lecture theatres, it's even potentially possible for that to happen, as I know from my experience over the last 2 days. But in this case, again, we're showing that there is dissociation related to group identity, is that which is successfully treated by the treatment programme at the Wellspring Centre. So again, a group-related psychopathology emerges as a consistent finding. And how does this relate back then? How do these findings relate back to totalistic identity theory? A small but statistically significant relationship exists between psychopathology, depression, dissociation, anxiety, and former group identity. This indicates then that if one has that dominant group identity that totalistic identity theory postulates, that this will lead to aspects of psychological harm emerging afterwards. I mean, we are only measuring it afterwards, but that relationship does appear to exist. Secondly, it's this part of the psychopathology which is successfully treated by the Wellspring method, and this is a method of treatment designed specifically to help with victims of thought reform and undue influence. So this indicates then that there is a group-based form of psychopathology. We now have some quite hard empirical evidence then that a group-based form of psychopathology does exist. And this is one which relates to the extent of group identity at the time that the person was in the group. This point is important because this indicates that how much the person became psychologically attached or how psychologically dominant the group became then relates to the level of psychopathology afterwards. So in other words, if one was going to advise somebody about their extent of identity, one could say that it's okay up to an extent for it to dominate, but maybe one should try not to dominate completely, because there may be some costs associated with that psychologically afterwards, and that's what this is bearing out. So this is evidence to back up then that for this population of ex-members of cults, they report high levels of extent of group identity that relates to these psychological symptoms. It's that relationship then that appears to be successfully treated at Wellspring, which indicates then that for these members or ex-members of the groups that there does appear to have been something akin to that totalistic identity which the theory postulates. So totalistic identity then emerges from this analysis as a way of conceptualising the dominance of group identity that can occur. I'm not saying it happens to everybody, because of course this was a specific sample, and also there was a range within that sample. But at the same time, it emerges as a way of conceptualising where there is that dominance, it can have those possible damaging effects. In other words, a highly dominant group identity that excludes all other levels of identity for a prolonged period of time, that exists on a highly polarised dimension in the social context, can be an unhealthy group identity for the individuals that are involved some of the time. And of course people will react to that differently. I'm not saying everyone reacts in the same way, but the evidence from the Wellspring data set does show that the more people identify with the group, the more dominant that group is, the more psychopathology is reported. And importantly, at the same time, the treatment effect shows that there is a group-based form of psychopathology that is being successfully treated by tackling specifically what that dominant group-based identity involved, the undue influence that Lifton and others have postulated. So the totalistic identity theory then is like all theories, is simply a conceptual framework for trying to explain in social psychological terms, what's going on in cultic groups at the sum of their members. So I conclude at that point, and thank you for your attention this morning.
Other questions for Roy?
The aegis, was that administered when people came in or when people were leaving Wellspring?
Both.
Both. Okay. So
intake and discharge.
And what was the reliability? What was the correlation between the two administrations?
I don't think the EGIS changed from intake to discharge.
Okay, so it seemed to be measuring something that was not being affected by the treatment itself.
That's correct.
My other question, I mean, what you're showing here is really fascinating, and I guess the alternative way of looking at it from my point of view would be that the extent of group involvement explains a significant amount of the variance, not a huge amount of the variance, about 25% of the variance. And so what are your thoughts about what is explaining the other 75%?
In terms of the psychopathology?
Yeah.
I think I'm prepared to accept that the extent of ability scale perhaps needs to be refined so that it measures or captures a higher proportion.
Okay.
That's number one. I think the other interesting thing is that it is quite hard to take a social psychological measure and demonstrate any shared variance with a clinical measure. So that's quite difficult. That's a slightly more defensive response to a question, but I mean, it is quite difficult to do that. I think the other point is what I said earlier, really. I think that when you're dealing with quite a varied ex-member population, there's going to be lots of other factors affecting it. And I think that's why, from the research day the other day, we were saying that we need to be sort of cautious and moderate in our claims. I think when people present with presenting symptoms and say, I've been in a group, I think it's important, and I know you know this, to say what parts of that might relate to the group experience, and maybe other aspects of that have got nothing to do with the group. So it's not surprising that there's a lot of the variance that doesn't appear to be related to the group at all. And of course, the other problem, very quickly, of course, is that the way that probabilistic statistics work like this always leaves large amounts of error variance. It's the name of the game in terms of the way the statistic is calculated.
Clearly, your data show that there is a significant impact. There's no question to that. My other two questions would be: is there any way that I think you pointed out one factor that may really have a big impact on that variance, and that is the amount of time between leaving the group and coming into Wellspring. Because I think that there probably my hunch would be that there are a lot of people who, if they were away from the group but not in any kind of treatment for a long period of time, that the pathology may actually increase over that period of time. That's been my clinical experience. The other question I would have is there any thought of doing the same kind of study, if you will, in other words, administering the EGIS along with scales of psychopathology to devoted football fans, for example, to people who may identify with very strongly with groups that we don't normally consider to be totalistic, except for Manchester, of course, which is a cult.
Manchester United, not City. Yes, I think absolutely. I would love the opportunity, and I'm happy to talk about this with you and others in the research network, about how we can perhaps take some of these scales and apply them to other group contexts as a way of comparing to the cultic group context. I think that would be very useful in a number of ways.
Is there any way to take out subgroups? You mentioned in passing that supposedly someone who's been in Scientology for 20 years might present in a different way from someone who's been in a very, very light impact group for, say, 2 weeks. In other words, when you aggregate data like this, it seems to me you're going to get an extreme averaging effect coming in.
Of course, and that's a very good point. It actually answers Steve's question, I think. I mean, I'm sure that if we took level to the amount of time in the group and had a cut-off and didn't include anybody who was in for less than a year, we might find higher correlations. That's a hypothesis. I'm not actually.
Well, I would ratchet it up even more.
Yeah.
5 or 10 years, I would expect to see a much more extreme.
Yeah, we could do some cut-offs. We could have a look at whether the correlations are significantly different between those different categories and stuff. Thank you.
I mean, you covered something that I was going to ask really, which is to what extent can you stratify the population group by different cults? I mean, because you've got 567 people there, but presumably they come from almost as many groups.
That's partly why it's difficult to stratify them. Actually, I mean, you've almost, in a sense, you've almost answered the question. I mean, obviously there are some fairly large samples from the better known cults, but there also are loads of small individuals from many groups, particularly groups in North America who exist in a particular small town somewhere. So I mean, it's quite difficult. I mean, what we've tried to do in the past is to try and create categories to describe the groups, like Bible-based, spiritualist, etc. You can do that, but I mean, in a sense, arguably you're messing about then with the categories, and sometimes it doesn't.
Because it would be nice to work that sort of information alongside qualitative information. For example, if you're talking about, we had Masood yesterday talking about the Mujahideen.
Yeah.
The techniques employed by that particular group relative to the extent of group identity, and also any harm suffered, and their idea of totalism, as compared with the Unification Church, for example.
Well, I think, again, that's a very good idea, the proposal to look at in the research network. Can we look at a specific group of ex-members and run a similar type of study with them using the same instruments to see whether we could get a similar finding within a specific population, particularly for an extremist group. That would be very interesting. The extremist group and the football fans is the two.
We have to move to the second presentation, maybe at the end.